You're listening to The Pipeline, the Western Standards National Affairs program, recording this Wednesday, February 26th, 2020. Each week, we break down the issues, discuss them in depth, and examine some of the broader implications for Western Canada and beyond, featuring from Calgary, the Western Standards publisher, Derek Fildebrandt. Derek, how are you today?
Aloha, I'm good.
Great. And Dave Naylor from Calgary, our news editor. Looks like you're in Abbotsford still, Dave?
Yep, still stuck in dreary Abbotsford, so this is the highlight of my week, Paul.
Fantastic. And hosted by myself, digital editor Paul Holmes from Victoria, British Columbia. Before we get the show underway today, I just want to let people know we are very close to our February membership goal. So to all of you who've signed up this month, and of course, every month, thank you for becoming a member of the Western Standard. If you haven't done it yet, please visit our website at westernstandardonline.com, and you can become a member today and watch for some interesting perks that'll be coming down the pipeline for members. Also, we have a new-ish YouTube channel, and we'd really love to get some more subscribers over there. So please go subscribe. You can get all of this content on YouTube as well. And for topics today, we're going to be talking about the carbon tax, the latest developments there. We're going to be talking about the Teck debacle, and I think that there's probably 12 layers we could go into there. So that'll probably be the bulk of the show today. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the Buffalo Declaration and the impact that that has had. So where do we want to start? Derek, good news or bad news?
Let's do good news first.
Good news. Okay, on the good news front, I think we will start with the carbon tax then. Dave, why don't you let us know the details of that ruling that came down from in Alberta this week?
Well, it was a rare victory for Alberta in the courts against Ottawa, Paul. It was a 4-1 victory that said the federal carbon tax was unconstitutional. Basically called it a Trojan horse, quote unquote, for getting taxes out. And so now it goes to the Supreme Court, and that'll be the last step to see whether or not it's still going to be around our necks.
And as I understand, are there other lower court cases that are still to be decided as well? Like, was it not being challenged in a few different courts in Canada?
Yeah, for the most part, all their court rulings were for the government. This is the first time we've actually had one that's come out against the government, and it was strong. I mean, it was not unanimous, but 4-1 is a pretty good victory. So the Supreme Court ruling is going to be very interesting.
And and if I understand correctly, the verbiage used by the judges in the case was quite strong. Essentially, if you care about the Constitution and the division of powers in the country, then this is how this has to stand. Am I kind of in the right ballpark there?
That's exactly fair, Paul. The quote I liked the best was that it was being used as a Trojan horse to sort of get inside Alberta and reap their tax benefit that way. So you're very correct. A very strongly worded ruling by the judges.
And Derek, before the show, you characterized this as good news. Do you think this is going to remain good news as it moves up the court to the next level?
It's impossible to say. So this is the third major court ruling on the constitutionality of the carbon tax. Ontario's challenged it and lost. Saskatchewan challenged it and lost. Other provinces that have been challenging it have done so as interveners, not directly with their own cases. But none of these cases have been unanimous. In cases where the federal government has won in Ontario and Saskatchewan, there's been significant dissenting opinions. In Alberta's case, it was the closest there was to a unanimous case, and it was on the other side where a provincial government won against the federal government. I don't have the exact count, but I've read it, the count of the number of justices ruling. If you make this a kind of almost a hockey series, it would be 1-2. But if you actually go by points, I think it's like 10-11 if you go by the number of justices ruling. in favor of the provinces against the federal government.
Hmm.
When it's inevitably now going to go to the Supreme Court, it's not yet known if it's going to go there as one big case, all three provinces challenging in one case, or if it's going to get there in bits and pieces. The three core challenges are different. They've had different arguments used. Obviously, Alberta's has had more success than the other two. But it's ultimately going to be decided at the Supreme Court. A majority of the justices there are appointed by Stephen Harper, and there were, I think there's at least one still there from Mulroney. But despite a majority of the Supreme Court being appointed by conservative prime ministers, the Supreme Court has made a lot of really funny rulings. I don't have particularly much faith in it as a sort of strict constructivist judicial doctrine. They've very often favored, ruled as constitutional a lot of policies that very clearly go against the Constitution, both in its spirit and its letter. This is the same Supreme Court that ruled that it was fine for the province of New Brunswick to charge people for moving beer across provincial borders. So I'm not saying this one's in the bag, but clearly the decision here in the court in Alberta was really the first victory we've seen, and should kind of wipe some of the smug smirk off the faces of people who say that Alberta is wasting its time and money in challenging this.
Well, and we see in the United States a lot with the Supreme Court there that oftentimes rulings come down based on the appointments, the judges that were appointed by Republicans coming down one side of the issue and the Republican or the Democrats appointed. Did we see that in the lower courts as well this time, or is that something that most people just don't pay that much attention to that we would even?
I don't know the composition of the lower courts here and who's from appointed by what parties. They're often very politically loaded. It is often a way of, and I don't want to cast aspersions on our judges here, but it is very often a political reward for service in the legal profession. People who have been allies of political parties. It happens fairly often. Not to say they're not good justices, but it's something that happens, and it happens in the United States as well. Federally, I'm more familiar with the composition of the court. Our Supreme Court comes down a lot less along partisan lines than the American Supreme Court. The American Supreme Court is very predictable about what side it's going to come down on, depending on what party's president appointed someone. At least lately, a lot of Nixon appointees would often side with Democratic appointments, but Nixon was not a particularly traditional conservative.
Sure.
But in the Canadian case here, the Supreme Court has some partisan divisions, but it generally comes down on the side that's wrong.
All right. Any other thoughts on where this is going, Dave?
Well, I think it's March Supreme Court. As Derek said, the federal lawyers probably got a bit of a shock with the Alberta ruling, and they're no doubt trying to get their game back up. And it's going to be very interesting. And I think there's just no guessing as to what this court is going to do.
The Supreme Court.
We should actually also point out, this will be a bit of a segue before we discuss the Teck Frontier Mine. But Ottawa was making all sorts of demands of Alberta to try and finagle us into essentially adopting NDP and Liberal policies in exchange for getting Teck approved. One of those conditions mentioned by Liberal cabinet ministers federally was that Alberta needs to drop its court challenge against the carbon tax. Now, Alberta, though, and by Jason Kenney's own admission, had actually given way, in my view, capitulated to Ottawa on nearly every single front on legislated. And we'll save most of this for the Teck discussion. But one of the conditions was that Alberta stop challenging this in court. That's something, obviously, that Alberta couldn't do. They were prepared to give them a heck of a lot, virtually everything, except for this. And they must have known that, because the case had already been done, they must have felt very good that it was going to go in their favor. So Ottawa, we see this after the fact, was telling Alberta to give up a court case that had already won, just didn't know it yet, in exchange for getting something that the Liberals were going to kill anyway.
Yeah. We may as well dive right into Teck. I think the only other point I would make around the this carbon tax ruling is, with the 3 different provinces and 3 different cases, the Supreme Court typically will push back and say, hey guys, come get together. We're going to do this once. They're not likely to hear 3 cases on this, essentially the same topic, right? Even if they're all a little nuanced and a little different. What do you think, Dave? You think that's the way this is going to go down in the end?
Oh yeah, I think they'll just do it as one. No point, spreading it out any longer than they have to. Let's get everybody in. Let's hear your arguments, and let's get a ruling, and let's get on with it.
So we were all waiting with bated breath for the future of the Federation at stake around the Teck mine approval. The lots of commentary coming from the various ministers in the Liberal government, and then suddenly, before the ruling came down from the cabinet, Teck pulls their application after spending significant sum of money trying to get this thing off the ground. And just a few weeks earlier, they were talking about the long-term viability of the project being very good. Dave, help us out here. What on earth went down, and then maybe we can all speculate on why.
Well, I think it was ironic that we were all just sitting down to watch the season premiere of The Walking Dead when Sunday night we get word that the Teck people had pulled the plug on the mine. 10 years and $1.3 billion they've invested in it, Paul, and to try and get it up to this stage. It's been sitting on Prime Minister Trudeau's desk since July. All the Indigenous bands around it supported it. They've been through numerous government checks. They all supported it. But the Liberal government was in a tough way because a lot of their MPs did not want to support it, and they were getting pressure from environmentalists. So must have come as a great relief to them Sunday night when Teck said, enough's enough, we're pulling the plug, citing all sorts of problems from railway disruptions to the political landscape in Canada now. So the company doing this took a big amount of pressure off the Trudeau government, no doubt about that.
Well, and Derek, I don't know if you care to speculate, but it seems like seems like you couldn't have given a nicer gift to Justin Trudeau as the CEO of this company. I imagine the shareholders just can't be super happy about it. But I'll let you go. You go, man.
I will go. No, this, as you both said, this obviously takes the sort of Damocles off from hanging over the Liberals' heads on this. On the one hand, they had, at least what the mainstream media sees as their credibility on the environment at stake if they approved it, or on the other side, firing the first cannons in a civil war if they killed it. And so Teck has taken it off. But what happened here is exactly what I had predicted in the column February 6th, titled, If Trudeau Kills Teck, It's War. And it is war, I think, because the Liberals did kill Teck, but they killed it in a very liberal way of doing it. The Liberals, as much as they might be a very clear progressive left party, they like to view themselves as still kind of in the middle, barely center left, balancing all things. They're the reasonable people who will hear out both sides. That's kind of their brand, even if it's not entirely true. And they did not want to be seen to be killing this. They had nothing to lose politically in the West. They have no seats between Vancouver and Winnipeg. But the backlash would have been very great. And maybe for once in our history, at least some people in other parts of Canada would have said, we don't like you picking on Alberta that much. At least, rural parts of Ontario and Atlantic that are not necessarily a part of that Laurentian consensus that the Liberals and many Tories rely upon. But what happened is exactly what myself and some other columnists had predicted, which is the Liberals are going to send all the signals that this is not going to get approved. Probably behind the scenes, we're pretty clear to Teck that this is not going to happen, and allow Teck to save face. Because if the Liberals had said no to this, forget the political ramifications. Just the effects for Teck would have been a crash in their stock prices. They've invested a huge amount of time and money into this, as you've already said. So this would have been a huge hit to their stock. They look like they're not in control. By withdrawing their application themselves before the Liberals can decline it, they keep the possibility of retabling this application at a future date if there's a different federal government that might be more open to it. But this is the equivalent of someone saying, you can't fire me, I quit. Mm-hmm. That's what happened here, but we knew very much that they were going to fire Teck from having the chance to do this. And, you know, at what point are Albertans and Westerners more broadly going to say this is not just another kick in the shin and, you know, we don't like it, but, you know, we'll just vote for someone else next time. We'll vote even more conservative next time. I mean, like, I'm not sure how many times we can say we're going to vote even more conservative to get our way and that doing nothing. This is, you know, as I wrote after this happened, Ottawa should be treated as a hostile colonial power that is at war with Alberta, and we need to treat them as such.
And your invoking of the word colonial was welcomed by all, as I understand on Twitter.
Yes, many of our liberal friends afflicted with white guilt really don't like us using that term. They think that should only apply in the context of Indigenous issues where none of us have any legitimate right to be here. But I think it's quite appropriate. We do not have proportion to our population representation in Ottawa. So we have taxation without representation, not as bad as perhaps as it was at the time of the Boston Tea Party, but we have taxation without representation, and we've got a government in Ottawa that sees it as its duty to strangle, maybe not shut down overnight, but to strangle out our industry in the name of Greta Thunberg and saving the planet.
Well, I, for one, when I saw your tweet, Derek, I immediately went and made some popcorn and waited for the inevitable Twitter war to. It's been a while. It's been a while since I've seen that. So hats off for you, flaming the haters.
It's a gift.
It's a gift. Anyway, back on track. Teck itself, Dave, you mentioned, you know, invested, in quotes, I suppose, $1.3 billion just trying to get this thing to this point, and was prepared, as I understand, to invest an additional, I think it was like $10 billion over the next decade. Do you remember 20. The numbers? Is it 20 billion? Yeah.
Well, 20 billion, I'm not sure if 20, the number that's out there is 20. I'm not sure if that's additional or gross, including what's already been sunk.
And of course, 7,000 high-paying construction jobs. If my numbers are right, you know, just a significant amount of investment that would have, you know, affected the Alberta GDP. I think the number I heard was that about 1% of Canadian GDP, and so whatever that breaks down to from an Alberta perspective, this is a real kick to the knees for Alberta. The way this has gone down. How is this? You know, for those who are living under a rock and don't tune in daily to the Western Standard, how is this playing out in Alberta?
Well, as you can imagine, it's gone over like a lead balloon. Interestingly, though, the very next day, Premier Kenney came out and said he invoked the Lougheed era and said, you know what, we are now going to get back in the business of being in business. Which scared the hell out of a lot of people because government doesn't do a very good job normally when they are in business. So Kenney didn't even rule out buying the Teck lease from them and operating the pipeline or the mine, getting it going that way. So he said there's Alberta money is coming into the energy sector, so we just got to wait and see what it's going to be. He says they're looking at anything and everything to buy. So that's a huge turnaround on government policy.
Well, that's it's worked out pretty well for Venezuela, as I understand.
Well, look, the reactions provincially have been bizarre here. Rachel Notley's was the most bizarre. She said the entire thing is Jason Kenney's fault for not being nice enough to Justin Trudeau. I
saw that.
I mean that we got to call bullshit on that one. I mean, it's the job of opposition leaders to be a pain in the butt of the government. But it should be at least somewhat plausible Under Rachel Notley's watch, we saw Keystone XL killed. We saw Energy East killed. We saw Northern Gateway killed. We saw Alberta turn over on its back to show its belly over the carbon tax. We tried that approach, and what did it get Alberta? Absolutely nothing. Jason Kenney screwed Rachel Notley whenever it suited him. Now,
You mean
Jason Kenney's
Justin Trudeau screwed?
Yes, Justin Trudeau did.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. And in fact, if anything, again, an outsider from British Columbia, I think, Rachel Notley appeared to be a very vocal advocate for all those projects you just mentioned, with the exception of the carbon tax, which was a little bit of a different animal. But
actually, Rachel Notley opposed the Keystone XL pipeline, Northern Gateway, and Energy East. She opposed them, just not vigorously, but she opposed them while in opposition, and they were killed swiftly once she became premier because they knew there'd be no one to speak up against it.
Oh, interesting.
But but Jason Kenney, he's obviously has a very different rhetorical line than Rachel Notley. He doesn't see himself as Ottawa's governor satrap representing Ottawa and Alberta. He doesn't see himself that way, but he is still a pretty ardent federalist, and his language was very careful not to inflame the situation. They obviously wanted Teck to get built, and they laid the blame at the federal government's feet. He did not mention Justin Trudeau once by name in his statement or in any of his subsequent press conferences after. Those who are here in the provincial election will know that he would repeat Justin Trudeau's name about 5 or 10 times a day in the same sentence as Rachel Notley as her good friend and ally, quote unquote, copyright. And he was very careful not to inflame anger at Teck. Their anger, they reflected disappointment and a little bit of anger and put it on Ottawa. But they didn't want to inflame it too much because they know that things are really at a potential boiling point here, and they didn't want to put it over the top. I thought that if Kenney is at all to blame here, it's for taking much too weak a position. He never drew a line in the sand with Ottawa, saying if you do this, there's going to be consequences. He just says Ottawa needs to do this. It's appropriate. Don't pick on us. And that's better than what Rachel Notley would have said, of course. But he never said that there's going to be a significantly greater consequence if Ottawa does this. Like, I don't know, maybe we should shut off the rails of oil shipments to Ottawa. That might be nice.
The Teck is based, of course, in Vancouver. And so we had this unique situation where you had a Canadian company investing a massive sum of money in Canada for an energy project. Now, of course, they'll move those resources to much kinder, more stable places in the world, like South America, and God only knows where else. What is this? What are we just done with energy development in this country? Like, can we just never do a major project again? Is that where we're at?
Well, why would you? Why would you go through all that hassle and money and just to have it sit there? Why would you spend that $1 billion? At the end of the day, though, Paul, they thought there was money to be made there.
Sure.
And they were going to go ahead with it, and they just got tired and fed up and pulled the plug. At the end of the day, they thought they could make that mine financially profitable. So there's money to be made there, as Premier Kenney keeps pointing out. The rise for oil is going to continue. The demand for oil is going to keep rising. But would any Canadian company want to invest in Canada? I can't see it.
I've long considered myself I suppose, soft environmentalist. I am concerned about the environment. I am concerned about climate change. Canada does play a role in all of that. But you kind of look at the consequence of something like this and you think, okay, great. So the same amount of money is going to be invested somewhere else, except without the environmental regulations, without, the labor standards, without any economic benefit to Canada itself. It just strikes me as just not holistically thought through. And, can we can't just jump tomorrow to a zero carbon economy and not expect there to be massive economic impact. And so, if we're going to move in that direction, it has to be very thoughtful. And I feel like that's been completely lost, big opportunity lost on this. And that's, again, for an outsider, being from British Columbia, the headquarters of Teck, but, obviously the impact to Alberta is massive in this case. Speaking of Alberta, let's move along to the Buffalo Declaration. Kind of went under the radar a bit in the mainstream media. Dave, why don't you lay it out for us and tell us a little bit about this Buffalo Declaration?
Buffalo Declaration is a manifesto, for lack of a better word, of 4 Alberta MPs, Conservative MPs, led by Michelle Rempel Gardner, who obviously spent a lot of time on this because it's very detailed, very thoughtful. It's basically what they want out of Confederation, what Alberta wants out of Confederation. I think it was Derek who called it the most important document since the Parti Québécois back in the 1980s. You're right, it did sort of go under the radar. Didn't get much pickup down east. There was a lot of sort of pushback, even amongst people like Mayor Nenshi of Calgary. Sort of told these people to calm down, and it kind of flew under the weather. If any one of us would have told a female MP to calm down, it would have caused a bit of a storm. But Mayor Nenshi seems to be able to get away with doing stuff like that. So what it has done, brought it up to the forefront again at a time where it needs to be mentioned. Through law, it was like a grenade landing in the middle of the Tory leadership race. They've all got to deal with that now. So I urge everybody to go to the Western Standard site and read it for yourself, because it is quite the piece.
Get yourself a cup of coffee first and give yourself 15 minutes or so. If you're a fast reader, or if you're a slow reader like me, give yourself 25. I got through the whole thing. Sorry?
There's no pictures in it either.
There's no picture. And you both know how much I love pictures, especially in when I read. It's a very meaty document. There's obviously a lot of thought went into that, and landed at a very interesting time in Canadian history. Derek, where do we go from here? What do you think is happening with this document?
Well, if I had written it, I would have made it a pop-up book. But I try to add a little flair to what I write. But no, it was a very, very important document. I actually have to take issue with what you guys have said. It actually, I think, did punch through into Eastern Canadian and mainstream media. Now, we had the exclusive here on the Western Standard. We've striven since the very first day we launched the Western Standard in late October last year to be the place where these conversations about the West place in Canada or outside of Canada takes place. And so we were privileged to have the exclusive first edition of it, and so we had people across the country reading it on the Western Standard. But it very quickly did actually catch into the mainstream media. This has been, it forced the Tory leadership candidates to respond to it, and Conservatives across the country. You had the Toronto Star calling it wingnutty. You had Andrew Scheer acknowledging it existed, but not commenting if he'll support it or not. They had Jason Kenney was repeatedly asked about it. He would not commit to it. He would just say about the different things he's doing for Alberta, but wouldn't commit to supporting it or not. Rachel Notley, though, said that this is a bunch of extremist nut jobs, and they're a part of Kenney's secret plan to become El Presidente for life of the Wild Rose Republic of Western Canada. So there was a lot of different reactions it provoked, but it did really draw a line in the sand. It had the support of Brad Wall and some other prominent Conservatives in the country, and so it really did help to drive the conversation. We're seeing in the news today there are some Tories of a redder hue in the Tory caucus who are very upset that this happened. They like not rocking the boat. The Tories have had overwhelming support in the prairie provinces, and they don't want to point out that maybe they actually haven't gotten the job done. They don't like that kind of conversation because this document isn't just against the Liberals. It's talking about the failure of Conservatives, past and present, to obtain real long-term wins for the West that can't simply be undone with the next Liberal government that inevitably will come along. So so this was Michelle Rempel, Arnold Viersen, Glenn Motz, and
Blake Richards.
Blake Richardson. Richards or Richardson?
Richards.
Richards, okay. The four of them really stuck their neck out like this. I can tell you, from my experience having been in a caucus, when you put out something that's not just pablum and doesn't have the sign-on of your leader, you're taking a real political risk. You're saying that you might not necessarily want a long career and pension to go with it, that you're actually willing to do something. And so really hats off to these four MPs for doing this. This is the boldest thing we've seen from Conservatives on Western issues since the firewall letter. I think it's actually bolder than the firewall letter, and coming from elected politicians who actually have something to lose by putting this out there, I'd say was an absolute earthquake and is really moving the conversation.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Michelle Rempel's name on that. It's not like she hasn't been outspoken in the past, but she tends to be reserved when she needs to about it, controversial issues. And I certainly don't see her as an extreme voice or any of the other ways that they were characterized by the left. The whole thing reminds me actually a little bit of the Green New Deal, or Canada's version of the Green New Deal. I can't remember what it was called, where it's sort of, it's the crazies, characterized as the crazies by the other side. But in this case, I actually felt like there was a lot of really sensible, well thought out ideas here. And, whereas in the case of the manifesto the NDP came up with a few years ago.
But there's a real difference. So, the Green New Deal in the United States, pushed by the far left of the Democratic Party. Well, let's put aside how credible or not they are. Obviously, I think we all agree about credibility of the Green New Deal versus the Buffalo Declaration. But some of that just our perspective, I suppose.
Sure.
But you're not supposed to do this in Canadian politics.
Right.
You're not supposed to have elected officials within a caucus speak their mind independently of the boring party line pablum. This happens in the United States where you have primaries and you don't have a leader of a party. You can just declare you're not a candidate anymore. In Canada, the leader decides if you have a seat or not, much more than even the voters do, especially if it's in Alberta. The only person who can ever take your seat away is the leader of your own party. But in the States where they have primaries, you have, congressmen and senators are much, much more independent than our members of parliament. So you're not really supposed to see that in the Canadian system. It's very much breaking the mold, and agree with them or not, it's brave.
That's all for The Pipeline this week. The Western Standard is made possible through support of members like you. If you're already a member, thank you. If you're not already a member, please join the movement by going to westernstandardonline.com and click membership. Did you know that you can find our podcast on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and most other places where you find your favorite podcasts? Visit our podcast page for more details. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a review, comment, and share this with a friend. The Western Standard is a publication of Wild Rose Media Corp. All rights reserved.